After a hiatus in March, we are back with the next edition of the Warbirds and Words Journal, and we're shifting gears to look at a UK aircraft manufacturer that is perhaps often overlooked. Established at the birth of military aviation in 1915, the Fairey Aviation Company Limited would produce a wide range of designs through both the piston and jet ages, with a focus on maritime platforms. While I don't propose in this edition to cover a full history of the company, that would be a weighty tome, we shall take a quick canter through some of the more notable designs, together with the usual mix of public domain records and imagery captured by yours truly across the UK. One of Fairey's first and most successful aircraft was the Fairey III, conceived in response to an Admiralty specification for a carrier-based aircraft for the RNAS. Featuring folding wings and powered by a Sunbeam Maori engine, the 3A featured wheels or skids and was intended to operate from carrier decks as a reconnaissance aircraft, while the 3B was intended as a bomber and designed as a floatplane. The type saw some limited action in the Great War, and naturally many iterations followed until the final mark, the 3F, which would also be the most produced, with over 350 examples flying with the Fleet Air Arm, numerous in the interwar period behind only the Hawker Hart family. Having cemented itself as a trusted designer, Fairey began to go from strength to strength. November 1922 saw the first flight of their Flycatcher prototype, a radial-engined biplane fighter, again designed to meet a requirement for a carrier-based aircraft. The Flycatcher beat out the Parnell Plover to gain endorsement for production, and featured flaps that ran the entire length of the trailing edges, an arrestor hook for engaging the new arrestor systems, and hydraulic brakes. With her extensive flap design, she could take off and land in as little as around 50 yards. Considering it was the backbone of the Fleet Air Arm's carrier-based fighter forces in the interwar period, tragically, no examples of the Flycatcher survive, save for a single replica built in the 1970s that is held by the Fleet Air Arm Museum. In the same year that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in Germany, Fairey would advance development on what would surely become their most famous type. On the company's own initiative and without any contract in place, work began on a new three-seat biplane that would fill the roles of both reconnaissance aircraft and torpedo bomber, a challenge for which Fairey felt confident in their abilities, given their established history by the early 1930s of producing effective maritime designs. The designation for this new type was TSR-1 for Torpedo Spotter Reconnaissance, but the world would come to know her as the Swordfish. When war came, the FAA boasted some 13 squadrons of Swordfish. This number would soon double. In July 1940, the Swordfish would be called upon for its first major attack on capital ships, but these vessels did not strictly belong to an enemy. They constituted the majority of the strength of the French fleet, whose government had just concluded an armistice with the Reich. The operation against Mers el-Kabir included 12 Swordfish from 810 and 820 NAS, who made several runs against the anchored fleet. The battleship Dunkirk was crippled. The value of an attack against a fleet in harbour using torpedo bombers like the Swordfish had been proven, and the next target was one that had been in the works since 1938, neutralising the Italian fleet at Taranto, from where they posed a lethal threat to the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. Taranto is worthy of a much more detailed separate discussion, but suffice to say that the events of the night of 11th of November 1940 cemented the Swordfish's role in history, and potentially as Fairey's greatest creation. Against the success of the Swordfish, the antithesis must be another of Fairey's interwar creations, the Battle. She was intended as the monoplane replacement for Hawker's incredibly successful biplane-like bombers, the Hart and Hind. Beating out competition from Hawker, Armstrong Whitworth, and Bristol, she first flew in March 1936. With the Merlin engine, she was the first operational type to field it. The Battle performed well in service trials, clocking in at over 250 miles per hour, far in advance of other contemporary bomber types, and very respectable against the biplane fighters of the day. But of course the fighters of the day were changing, and at unparalleled speed. When the Battle flew in 1936, the Bf-109 had already made its maiden flight some 10 months earlier, ushering in a new era of fast monoplane fighters. For the observant, the writing was on the wall, or rather in the sky, specifically the skies above rapidly rearming Germany. But Britain's own pressure to rearm was considerable, and those who speculated that the Battle could be unfit for a coming war with the Reich were, if not actively suppressed, then certainly outvoted by those who viewed combat mass as the most important priority, so much so, in fact, that the Air Ministry placed an order for the battle even before the prototype flew. I don't propose to review the exploits of the battle in detail, that is for a future article, but as part of the RAF's No. 1 Group contribution to the Advanced Air Striking Force, AASF, it is difficult to see her performance as anything but woeful. Against Jagdwaffe opposition, the results were as could have been expected, especially when battles frequently operated without a fighter escort. During those dark days in France, it was all too common for only one aircraft from a flight to return, or often none at all. If the Swordfish was excellent and the battle a disappointment, to put it kindly, the Fulmar was somewhere in between. She had in fact been intended as a design to replace the battle, but was modified instead to be a two-crew naval fighter for both reconnaissance and fleet protection. Another Merlin-powered machine in action at the beginning of the war, her performance was underwhelming, like the aircraft she was originally planned to replace. But the Fulmar had some important characteristics going for it. She was sturdy, easy to produce, and equipped with a respectable 8 Brownings, like her Spitfire and Hurricane cousins. Like many early war types, the Fulmar seems to have escaped the limelight, but was nonetheless critical to several decisive operations, such as the protection of the Operation Pedestal convoys. Sub-Lieutenant Stanley Orr, a highly ranked Fleet Air Arm ace, scored many of his victories in the Fulmar. As the war came to a close and the jet age began, Fairey turned its attention once again to satisfying a naval requirement, this time for an anti-submarine warfare ASW aircraft that could deter the new threat of the Soviet fleet. Their answer was the Gannet, a turboprop aircraft that would utilize a clever trick to boost endurance. The Gannet's Armstrong-Siddeley double Mamba featured 2 turboprop engines powering contra-rotating props through a combining gearbox. In the cruise, one engine could be shut down and the prop feathered to conserve fuel. With its considerable bulk, the Gannet was soon adapted to fill other roles, including as an airborne early warning (AEW) and electronic countermeasures (ECM) platform. In the former capacity, she was retired in 1978, just a few years before a conflict in which she was perhaps sorely missed. A mild export success, the Gannet saw service with the Royal Australian Navy, the West German Navy, and the Indonesian Navy. There are several survivors in the UK and around the world, although sadly none are airworthy. 6 years before Fairey would disappear as an independent manufacturer, perhaps their most eye-catching design took to the skies. It would also be their last. On 6th of October 1954, the Fairey Delta FD-2 made its first flight. Designed in response to an Air Ministry requirement for a research aircraft, the FD-2 racked up some impressive numbers. The first jet aircraft to exceed 1,000 miles per hour in level flight, rocket-powered aircraft had already achieved this. She smashed the airspeed record on 10th of March 1956 with an impressive 1,132 miles per hour, more than 300 miles per hour faster than the previous standard. The FD-2 might perhaps have spawned production fighter derivatives, such as the proposed FD-3, but Duncan Sandys' 1957 white paper strangled such concepts, as it did for all UK manufacturers. But the legacy of the FD-2 did endure, as one of the prototypes was modified and used to test aerodynamic refinements for the Concorde. Although some elements of the business survived into the late 1970s, 1960 effectively saw the end of Fairey as an independent UK manufacturer of military aircraft, through a merger with Westland. The company's legacy is an interesting tapestry of success and failure, with the battle an inescapable entry in the latter column, but striking triumphs such as the Swordfish in the former, an aircraft that did devastating damage to the fleets of Britain's enemies. Fairey may never be as famous a manufacturer as Hawker or Supermarine, but the company's designs certainly deserve a second look in understanding the highs and lows of Britain's military aviation history.